palace slept beneath 100 domes of gold. Outside, the Bosphorus breathed quietly, a sheet of black glass, reflecting torchlight and empire. Inside those marble walls, every sound was ritual. The slow shuffle of eunuchs, the whisper of silk, the nervous rustle of women waiting behind curtains. Tonight, Princess Fatima Sultan was to become a wife. At 15, she was already a symbol. Born of the House of Osman, daughter of the Sultan, whose word could move armies. But power in the Ottoman court was a veil. It glittered in daylight and suffocated at night. In the harem of Topkapi, she sat motionless beneath the hands of attendants, their fingers weaving gold into her hair. Each braid tightened like a warning. The air was heavy with musk and jasmine. It smelled of ceremony and fear. Beyond the carved screens, drums echoed from the outer court. Slow, deliberate, the heartbeat of empire. Her mother, Valide Sultan, stood behind her. Her eyes were steady, but her voice trembled when she said, "Daughter, remember, a princess is not a bride. She is a treaty wrapped in silk." Fatima nodded, but her reflection in the mirror did not move. The mirror, an imported Venetian glass, showed a child dressed as an empress. Outside, the corridors were already filling with whispers. Servants carried trays of sherbet, cushions, incense. The chief eunuch moved like a shadow, ensuring no man's eyes would see what was not allowed. Tonight's ceremony was less a wedding than a negotiation between families who spoke through gifts and glances. When the muezzin's call drifted across the palace gardens, the preparations ceased. Fatima's hands trembled. Her mother placed a silk veil over her head. "Do not fear the man," she whispered. "Fear the silence that follows." The words clung to her like perfume she could not wash away. The procession began. Through corridors lined with servants and concubines, she walked barefoot, a bride of empire, wrapped in crimson silk, embroidered with verses from the Quran. The gold thread caught the torchlight. It looked like fire-consuming cloth. At each archway, an elder murmured blessings for fertility and obedience. The groom waited in the pavilion of the crescent, a chamber scented with amber and wine. He was a vizier's son, chosen not for love, but for politics. He wore white silk and jewels gifted by the Sultan himself. He had never seen Fatima's face, but tonight the veil would reveal more than beauty. It would test obedience. The princess entered the room as musicians struck a single note. The door closed. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that holds its breath before history exhales. Fatima lowered her gaze. Custom demanded she speak no word until her husband touched her veil. But before he could, the door opened again. A matron entered with a bowl of milk and a folded sheet of white linen. The groom frowned. Fatima understood. Every royal marriage required proof. The morning after, the sheet would be displayed to the women of the court, a sign of purity, of virtue, of obedience. And if it was not marked, whispers could destroy dynasties. When the matron left, the chamber seemed smaller. The air pressed against the princess's lungs. She felt her pulse in her wrists, in her throat, in the cage of her ribs. Across from her, the groom smiled nervously. He too was a prisoner of tradition, chained by expectation. Outside, the storm broke over the palace roofs. Thunder rolled across the Bosphorus. Rain streaked down the latticed windows like tears. Inside, The candles burned lower, and the night began its slow ritual of fear. No one in the corridors spoke of love. They spoke of duty. In the Ottoman world, marriage was a language of power, and every word had a price. Fatima understood that her first night was not hers to live, but the empire's to witness. And as she lifted her veil, she whispered a prayer, not for mercy, but for memory. Because in Topkapi, memories lasted longer than lives. The rain had stopped, but the palace had not slept. Every window still glowed with candles, each one a witness that dared not speak. At dawn, the pavilion of the Crescent stood silent, its silks damp, its perfumes spent. In the courtyard below, the attendants waited. Among them, the matrons of the harem, veiled in black, carried a folded white sheet. They moved like priests at a funeral procession. The linen was spotless. By tradition, they would display it before the Valide Sultan. It was a ritual older than the empire itself, proof that purity had been taken, proof that duty had been done. But that morning, the sheet told no story, and silence was its only confession. When Valide Sultan saw it, her breath caught. Her daughter's honor was now a blade that could cut both ways. If word spread that the night had failed its purpose, rival mothers would whisper treason. For in Topkapi, virtue was currency, and rumor the sharpest weapon. She sent the matrons away and locked the door. "Bring her to me," she said. Fatima entered moments later, her eyes hollow from a night that had never ended. Her veil was gone, her hair undone, her wrists trembling. The Valide's gaze held her still. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. Fatima's voice cracked. "He tried," she whispered. "He was afraid." The mother closed her eyes. A vizier's son, chosen for obedience, not courage. He had failed the empire, but it was the princess who would bear the blame. Within the hour, the court physician was summoned. He was old, discreet, and familiar with such secrets. Behind closed doors, he confirmed what everyone feared. No mark, no proof. And in a palace where truth mattered less than appearance, this absence could ignite a war. So the Valide gave her order. Before sunset, the linen would be stained. By art, not by act. A needle, a finger, a drop of animal blood, just enough to silence the whispers. The empire, she said, must never look weak. Fatima begged her to stop, but her mother's voice was iron. History does not ask if you suffered, she said. It only remembers if you obeyed. As the physician obeyed, the princess turned her face toward the wall. The candlelight danced across her tears. Outside, the drums began to beat again, announcing celebration. The sheet was carried once more, this time bearing the stain of deception. The women cheered. The empire exhaled. By evening, gifts arrived from every corner of the palace. Necklaces of emerald, pearls, and a dagger inlaid with gold. Symbols of power and warning. The groom was paraded through the halls. Drunk on relief, he bowed before the Sultan, who smiled with pride, never knowing how fragile that pride had become. In the harem, Fatima lay in silence. The noise of the feast seeped through the marble, like a dream she could not wake from. Servants praised her purity, her beauty, her obedience. Each word fell on her like a stone. When midnight came, she rose and walked barefoot to the window. The city slept beneath her, its domes and minarets silver under moonlight. She touched the glass and whispered to herself, "If they must see blood to believe I am worthy, then they will never see me as human." That night, she did not cry. She learned the Empire's first lesson, that truth was a luxury for those without crowns. The palace awoke to celebration. Trumpets sang across the courtyards. Servants scattered rose petals. Poets rehearsed verses that would gild the lie. No one asked about the truth, because in Topkapi, truth was dangerous currency. Princess Fatima sat by her window, sunlight washing her in gold. She could not feel. The sheet had been displayed, the whispers silenced, her name restored. Yet every cheer outside her walls sounded like mockery. Down in the harem, gossip bloomed like rot in damp corners. Women who had once pitied her now envied her jewels. A lie, repeated enough, becomes virtue. A wound, hidden long enough, becomes legend. Fatima's husband was rewarded with lands and titles. At court, he smiled, spoke of loyalty, and avoided her eyes. In private, silence ruled between them, cold, polite, unbroken. Each meal was a ceremony of distance, each glance a treaty of shame. When months passed and no child came, the rumors returned. Physicians were called, prayers were ordered, relics kissed. But some servants whispered that God himself had refused to bless deceit. The Valide Sultan heard those whispers and acted swiftly. She summoned her daughter to the gardens, where fountains whispered secrets older than the empire. "Silence will protect you," she said. "Speak, and you feed the wolves." Fatima bowed, though every word felt like a chain tightening around her throat. At night, she wandered the marble corridors, where shadows gathered like memories. In one forgotten wing, she found the calligraphy of earlier princesses, scratched into the plaster. Names, half erased by time. They had lived, married, vanished. She traced a finger over their ghosts and realized she was one of them now. The following year, the empire waged another war. Her husband left with banners and cannons, returning months later with scars and stories. But no affection. He drank more than he prayed. The empire's victories did not reach their bedchamber. Fatima began keeping a small book, a secret diary stitched in blue silk. In it, she wrote the truths no one dared to hear about the night that never happened, the stain painted by her mother, the mask she wore each morning. She hid it behind the base of a golden lamp, where only dust kept her confidences. Years passed. She learned to host banquets, to smile at ambassadors, to bless the children of others. But in her eyes flickered the quiet of a woman who had seen her faith turned into theater. Then, one evening, a concubine from the harem approached her in secret. The girl was barely 16, trembling, veiled in crimson. "They say I am to marry a pasha tomorrow," she whispered. Her eyes pleaded for mercy. Fatima said only one thing: "Hide the sheet before they bring it." The next morning, the concubine was gone, sent to a distant province, perhaps saved, perhaps silenced. But the rumor spread that the princess had interfered with tradition. The sultan summoned her. In the great audience hall, surrounded by gold and fear, Fatima stood barefoot before the throne. Her father's face was unreadable. "Why?" he asked. "Do you shame your family with pity?" She answered quietly, "Because pity is all that's left of truth." For a moment, the court froze. The Sultan's eyes softened, but only for a breath. Then he dismissed her, not in anger, but in exile. From that day, Princess Fatima Sultan lived in a smaller palace on the edge of the Bosphorus, attended by a handful of loyal servants. She became a ghost in her own dynasty, a lesson whispered to younger brides: obey or vanish. And in the stillness of her exile, she wrote again in her hidden book, "Silence has a price, but to speak is to lose everything." The Bosphorus had forgotten her name. Years passed like slow tides against the palace walls, polishing the silence around Princess Fatima Sultan until it gleamed. Her exile was not a cell, but a mirror, showing her what the empire refused to see. In the small garden behind her villa, she planted roses and kept no court. The servants who remained were loyal to her quiet. They learned to speak with gestures, to move as softly as wind through reeds. She spent her mornings watching ships drift toward the Golden Horn, each sail a rumor from a world that had outgrown her. Sometimes she saw the reflection of her youth in the water, a bride wrapped in crimson, a daughter kneeling to duty, a girl who once believed obedience could earn peace. The reflection never looked back. The empire outside her gates grew louder. New sultans rose, old palaces filled with new brides. The rituals continued, polished by habit. Sheets were still displayed. Silence still bought survival. But Fatima's diary kept growing, line by line, page by trembling page. It became her rebellion in miniature, the only truth allowed to exist in ink. She wrote of the storm that broke the night of her wedding, of her mother's trembling command, of how fear had built an empire more enduring than stone. She hid the book inside a cedar chest beneath her bed, sealed in silk. "Someday," she wrote, "a woman will open this and know she was not alone." When her husband died in campaign, a letter arrived, bearing neither grief nor comfort. It simply returned her dowry. She stared at the gold coins until dawn, then ordered them melted into candlesticks for the mosque nearby. If her life could not be holy, perhaps her sorrow could light the prayers of others. Old age came quietly, her hair silvered, her hands forgot their steadiness, but her eyes never dulled. Children of fishermen played near her garden walls. She smiled and gave them figs through the gate. They called her the Lady of the Wind, because her voice was as soft and constant as the sea. One winter, illness took her to bed. From her pillows, she could hear the muezzin's call and the creak of ships in the harbor. She asked her maid to bring the diary. Her last words were simple: "Let it be read when the empire forgets its daughters." When dawn broke, the maid found her gone, face turned toward the window. The candle beside her had burned to the base. Years later, after the fall of the Ottomans, scholars cataloging relics in abandoned villas found a cedar chest bound in rusted iron. Inside, they discovered a diary wrapped in silk, its ink faded but legible. It spoke not of battles or kings, but of fear, tenderness, and truth hidden behind veils. The diary passed through collectors' hands, translated, censored, lost, and rediscovered again. Each century claimed it, each tried to quiet it, yet the words refused silence. Today, fragments survive in archives, lines copied by students who never knew her face, and every time a voice questions the weight of tradition, a whisper seems to rise from those pages, that obedience without understanding is only another name for captivity. In the end, history remembered Fatima Sultan not for the sheet, not for the palace, but for the courage of ink. Her whisper outlived the drums, the thrones, the very empire that tried to contain it. And when the Bosphorus wind moves through Istanbul at dusk, carrying the smell of roses and rain, some swear they can still hear it, the faint rustle of silk and paper, a woman's voice, unbroken at last, telling the world she was never afraid of her wedding night, only of the silence that followed.